Welcome to the Developers Who Test podcast, a podcast for developers who embrace test automation so they can ship better quality software faster and have more fun doing it. I'm your host, Chris Harbert, and I'm here today with Ben Bischoff. Ben is a test automation engineer for Travago, a conference speaker, and the author of Writing API Tests with Karate. Today's episode of the Developers Who Test podcast is brought to you by Testery.com. Whether you're a developer who has just a handful of tests or even thousands, then your tests deserve to be running on the fastest and most reliable platform for open source testing. With AI-driven insights and analytics, unparalleled parallelism, and awesome integrations, Testery enables you to get more from your tests. Check us out today at Testery.com. Welcome to Developers Who Test, Ben.
Thanks a lot, Chris. Glad to be here.
Yeah, thank you. I typically like to start these out with asking people how they started their journey into test automation. And we see a lot of people who start out in test automation and later move into development. But it looks like you started out as a developer and then moved into test automation. That's something you and I have in common. So I'm really curious, why did you decide to make that transition and how did you do it?
Yeah, I'll try to keep it short because it's quite a long journey. I started as a developer, and my first company that I worked for actually went bankrupt. So I pretty quickly started doing freelance jobs, and I stuck with that for 6 years. And pretty much my last freelance job was in the games industry, and there I was hired with a permanent contract because I had the chance to work on a game as a developer. And later this game was canceled. So I went to a tools and services team, and we were doing software for game teams all around the world. And there was my first contact with software tests because we were doing things that had a real impact on marketing and money. So it had to be tested. And that's when I just started doing it using Selenium. That was my first tool that I ever used. And I became more and more fascinated with it. So I quickly knew that I had to go more into this direction. And this career choice is now 7 to 8 years ago. So since then, cool. I have been working as a test automation engineer, and I wouldn't go back to just developing.
Cool. Yeah. So what kind of, there's different flavors of Selenium. Which flavor of Selenium was it?
The Java one.
Java Selenium. Cool.
Yeah, Java Selenium. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I remember running my first web test. I think it was in Water, which was web application testing in Ruby, one of the earlier frameworks. And I remember the first time it opened up the browser and started clicking on things, filling out forms. It just felt like magic to me. Yeah. And, here I am almost 20 years later, and it still feels like magic every time I see it. So I love that.
Yeah, that's exactly what I wanted to say. It still feels really cool to see browsers and devices just doing what you want. But I also am a test automation engineer in backend now. That's my specialty, has been for the last 2 years. So I'm doing a lot with APIs and cloud and databases and various other stuff. So that feels equally magical, even though you don't have any browsers or UIs that you can follow.
Yeah. Yeah. So, how would you consider, since you've done both, what would you consider being different about the kind of code you write for tests versus the kind of code that you write for an application?
Not that different, actually. So the kind of code you write for an application should be well tested, but so should be your test code and your test framework code. I mean, I'm pretty much using the same standards for test automation and writing tests that I would use when I write an application or a web project. So for me, there's not that much difference. It's just the purpose of the software is a little different. One is the application for the user, maybe directly, and the other one is an application that tests that application.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
this application that tests also has to be tested. So it's never
Yeah, I
ending.
love that you bring that up. I remember that being controversial at a number of points in my career of should you test the tests themselves? Should you refactor the tests themselves? And teams that don't refactor their tests end up with tests that are difficult to maintain, just like teams that don't refactor their development code end up with development code that's difficult to maintain. So it seems pretty obvious that you should be refactoring. And one of the reasons that we have tests in place is to make it easier to refactor, so that you're
Yeah,
improving the design of the code without changing its functionality. Uh, so it feels like it should be obvious that you test your tests,
yeah,
and yet
yeah,
nobody does it,
absolutely.
or a lot of people don't do it. Yeah.
I think for me, it's very obvious because your test framework and your tests have to be, I mean, you have to trust them. You have to be able to say, okay, if this fails, it's the application and it's not a bug in the tests or the framework themselves. So I think you should eliminate all of those things, so you can be sure that when something fails, it's not the test.
Yeah. So, what's your approach to API testing? Like let's say you have a new endpoint or set of endpoints coming up for a new feature. Like, what are the first things that come to mind of what should be tested?
Well, it depends again. I mean, that is the obvious answer to everything. It depends. So what I would do first is check the documentation, um, check like Swagger documents, talk to the developers maybe if it's not complete yet, and also start exploring. I mean, exploration is a big part of it, and
Hmm.
I tend to use karate now for obvious reasons. That's also why I wrote that book. So I would
Hmm.
use karate or maybe Postman before that just to explore what the API does, how it behaves, what error codes I could maybe provoke, and also, of course, what the most pressing use cases are and what the happy paths are, and just test the low hanging fruits first.
One of the interesting things about doing exploratory testing on an API is, the customers of an API, whether they're internal developers or external developers, they need to be able to do that same activity to kind of tell what the functionality is. And if there's anything confusing about it, that's the kind of thing that could easily lead to bugs further
Yeah,
down the road. So I like that idea of having testers kind of do exploratory testing on the API just to say, like, is this consistent with our standards for other endpoints? Does it make sense? Are we returning the same return codes for the same types of situations? So, I like that. Um, what are some of the other things you like about using karate? I mean, if you liked it enough to write the book about it.
yeah. It took quite a while to grow on me, to be frank here, because I am a developer and I love writing code. And for karate, you have to write much less code, because everything is self-contained pretty much in the scenarios. So you write gherkin syntax, and inside this gherkin
Hmm.
syntax, you have some predefined steps that can communicate with the APIs. So I didn't really like that thinking at first, but once I started using it, it really grew on me because you're so quick with it. You don't have to write all this boilerplate code. You don't have to write any glue code to connect Java code to test steps, and all of that is gone. So that
Mhm.
That's really cool. And also, it's really, really powerful because you can do JavaScript, you can do Java, you can mix both. You can pretty much tackle any backend use case you want with this tool. And
Mhm.
that's what I really like about that.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, I've been a big fan of the BDD style testing, in particular for APIs, for some time. Because whoever's using the API can typically write a Gherkin syntax for an API pretty well.
Yeah.
I know BDD got a lot of pushback because initially there were some people who thought, like, oh, if I just create Gherkin syntax for a feature, then I don't have to write code in order to implement tests anymore. And now we don't need developers to help out with testing. We can just have business owners write what they want to have happen in this specific syntax, and we'll just automatically get everything for free. And of course, that's not how it worked.
Yeah,
uh,
exactly.
and yeah, but with the API testing, because your users for an API tend to be more technical, they're willing to write something in a Gherkin type syntax. And because the endpoints, like one endpoint to the next, is very similar to another endpoint. So once you get the reusable steps in place, now you've just got them. So I really like that approach that you're taking to your API testing there.
Yeah, and it's also relatively easy to maintain and just share the knowledge about it because in its basic form, there's not too much that you need to run it or to write it. I mean, the basic thing, how to write the gherkin, um, it's easy to learn. When it comes to more complex use cases, you have to dive in a little deeper, but the basic thing is really easy to learn and to teach too.
Yeah, so I was thinking some about Travago and taking a look at your site and thinking about, well, how would I test that, or what have I tested that's similar? And I've tested other sites that where you're searching aggregated data that comes from different partners or sources, which seems like that's sort of the problem you're solving there, right? Um, so like one of the challenges I've run into with testing sites like that is how do you handle third party integrations? So I'm curious, when your tests have to rely on third parties, what techniques or approaches are you taking to make the tests test what they need to test, but at the same time be reliable and under your control?
Yeah, that is one of the typical shift left things because the API and the partner integrations themselves should ideally be tested as early as possible. So on an API level or even before that. Um, we are actually using a Selenium-based framework for end-to-end tests. So testing the whole flow of the site. That means we're also testing with real partners, but sending along with that special information so those tests can be flagged as test data and filtered out from all of our systems and also the partner system.
Mhm.
So yeah, we deliberately decided to use real the real thing. Also because we're not
Mhm.
typically making any bookings, but it's a meta search, so it's more about searching and redirecting. So it's not that
Mm.
dangerous to use the real thing. For
Yeah.
critical money,
Yeah.
like where you could actually lose money applications, I would probably do some mocking of those partner integrations.
It's interesting because I've seen some people mock the third party integrations so that they can get fast and reliable tests. But then what you lose is, and this is so important with third party integrations, is they might be changing how their integration works multiple times a day, daily, weekly. They may or may not tell you that it's happening.
Yeah.
And I've had a very important partners that we've integrated with before where they would make a breaking change. They wouldn't even know they're making a breaking change, and they still wouldn't tell people. And one of the most awesome things about having good, reliable automated tests is you find out about things like that as soon as they happen, instead of finding out about them when your customer reports the issue. And so if you're mocking something, that's just saying our stuff works against the snapshot in time that was our understanding of what their system was supposed to do. It's not testing what does their system actually do anymore. But the flip side of that, of course, is then if their system goes down, now your tests are red and you can't deploy or something like that. So it seems like an interesting balance you have to strike, right?
Yeah, I also have to say that we're not only doing two different kinds of testing in one place, but we have multiple teams that also do their own testing. So the teams that are responsible for the partner integrations also have automated tests in place and monitoring and alerting and all of that, because they have to get this information as soon as possible. If we get this information or this failure when we are running the end-to-end tests, it might be too late. And also it's much harder to find the right people to talk to if something like that happens. So that's what shifting left should be all about.
Yeah, that's cool. So your integration team, they have all the contact info for the partner, and they're doing their own set of testing. And so if the partner isn't delivering what they're supposed to be, they know exactly who to talk to, and it doesn't even hit your CI/CD pipeline at that point, it sounds like.
Yes, exactly.
Cool.
And we are also, that might be interesting as well. We're running our end-to-end tests, a small set of them also as monitoring. We have a lot of monitoring in place all over the pipeline and software development and application flow, but as a safety net, we're also doing that as monitoring. And this kind of monitoring, like simulating a user going through the whole flow constantly, like around the clock, that caught some issues that nothing else has caught. So that was, I think, a very good decision.
Yeah, I'm glad you say that. It's like the production smoke test thing. And I was putting together for our blog an article on, what were the top most expensive failures or most catastrophic software failures of the previous year. Which is a very fun article to write. But I was thinking about, the types of bugs that seem to have the big impacts. And almost all of them are things like configuration changes, where it's like, oh, we wrote the code in dev and we had a dev config. We updated the QA config before we ran it, but we forgot to update the production config. We added a new variable and that never got added to the configuration file, and that caused some big massive outage.
Yeah.
And to me, that's what the production smoke test is all about, right? It's the first time you've got the real thing, and you obviously don't want to test everything, and you don't want production to be the first time you do anything. But it feels like almost like malpractice to put something out in production and not even like take a peek at the things that are mission critical to your business. Like, can people sign up? Can they create can they submit a lead for your sales team? Can they sign up for a paid account? Like, these are the things that are so important to our companies. And yet a lot of times we're just tempted to put it in production and not even check.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there are so many things that can go wrong that monitoring or earlier testing doesn't find. It's like the live side has things like cookie banners and other like other tracking pixels and all of that stuff that can interfere with the functionality. So this can only be found when we test the whole thing and the whole end-to-end flow, because monitoring could say, yeah, if we ping this website, we get a 200, it's all okay. but the website can be completely unusable. So you have to test at every stage.
Yeah. So, aside from the integrations with third parties, I was thinking of another challenge we've run into when testing these kind of aggregation site type situations. And, this is a challenge in a lot of end-to-end software testing, but in particular, I think when you're aggregating third-party data, what do you do about your test data management approach? Like, how do you make sure that your API tests are working with a reasonable set of data?
Lots of discussions. And like you said, you cannot test everything, so you have to be reasonable of what you can test and what would be like a significant set of test data.
Hey Ben.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, your audio's cutting out. I'm gonna try
Oh,
turning off my camera. Would you mind
okay.
turning off yours too?
Yes.
Let's just see if that helps the audio.
All right. Is this
Wait, sorry,
better?
continue with that.
Oh,
So
yeah.
far, yeah.
All right. So, what I wanted to say is you have to be reasonable and find a representative set of data that would cover most things that are critical. I mean, our test data is usually managed by QA, by the QA team, which I technically belong to. So I found the QA engineers know best what the right thing to test would be because they have an overview of the whole application and the whole teams and the whole application flow. And they also have the biggest voice when it comes to releasing a new version of anything. So they are the ones who decide. But we also keep in contact with all the parties, and if something happens that we didn't expect, we turn it into another test.
Yeah, that's interesting. So you do have dedicated developer and QA roles. Are they manual QA? Do they also do test automation, or do the
Um,
developers do test automation?
Most of our QA engineers now do both. In fact, I do both as well. Like I said, I do API exploration and UI exploration as well. But our other QA engineers who have started in this role are better in that discipline than I am. But we're all doing both usually. And the developers
Okay,
do
yeah,
their
that's
own.
cool. And so they're the one.
Oh,
Sorry,
sorry.
and so they're the ones that are creating. So they're the ones that are creating the test data, and they do a. So I guess there are a few different approaches to creating test data. Sometimes you can generate your own test data. Sometimes the test itself creates the test data. They might be writing SQL. What's generally your approach to how the test data gets created?
That heavily depends on what the underlying technology is. I mean, when we have tests that rely on like Kafka streams or BigQuery tables, they are usually used as a data source. Um, Depending on the kind of tests, we can also have data right in the test code itself, or just read from files or from other sources. The main thing, regardless of where the test data is coming from, is that it can be managed and people know where it is coming from and how it's retrieved.
Yeah, that sounds like a good approach. I've seen some teams where you're tempted to just rely on production data for your test data, but that has a lot of problems. These days there's a lot of privacy and security concerns with dealing with production data. But even without considering those, the issue or the scenario you're trying to test might not have even happened in production yet. So maybe you need to build a system that is going to respond correctly if a partner sends you a file that's in the wrong format or changes their API. You can only test those things if you're setting up the test data for those scenarios, for things that haven't happened in production yet.
Yes, exactly. So for things like testing logins and registrations, we create test data, and we also have test accounts that we use for this. And for the data integration with partners, in case it's files they send us, we also create our own files with data that we know and that we can assert more easily than dealing with dynamic data all the time.
Yeah, it sounds like you've got a pretty good approach there. Uh, so what kind of challenges are you working on today? What's something that is an interesting project in the testing world that you're trying to solve?
I would say, yeah, at the moment, my main challenge is um, rewriting our whole Selenium based end to end test framework, which is close to finishing. Because I wanted for the past years do that mainly because it did not have the ability to natively run tests in parallel. I mean, we have our ways
Mm.
to do that, and we're running uh, sometimes 50 or more scenarios in parallel, but it's not natively supported. So that was my main concern. What I did before, which was very interesting and very challenging, is I had to write an extension for the Karate framework for testing gRPC and protobuf. So
Mm.
that was kind of tricky, but I think we have a very nice solution in place now. But that's also the cool thing about my role. I mean, you have constant new challenges being thrown at you, like testing BigQuery tables in Google Cloud, or doing API testing, doing gRPC, doing GraphQL. Just a lot of technologies that you have to know.
I totally agree with you on that. And since this is a podcast for developers who test and testers who develop, one of the things I like to highlight is how much of a challenge true test engineering really can be from a development perspective and from an engineering perspective. So, for example, like the ones that you mentioned, sometimes it's the test engineers who get to be the first ones to try out the new technologies because they have to figure out a way to test it. Whereas, the team wants to hesitate a little bit on putting the new technology into production uh, for the first application of it because it's not fully tested yet. So sometimes we get to try the new tools first, but it's also a different engineering challenge. A lot of development these days is how do I put a field on a form and get it to write to a database when I click the save button, and we've been solving that problem for so long it's not really interesting anymore. But when it comes to how do you get a system that reliably scales to run automated tests against a complex system to determine whether or not it's ready to ship to production, that's still a pretty challenging problem, right?
Yeah, exactly. Plus, you have to deal with things like build pipelines, reporting, monitoring, data streams, queues. I mean, all of that, because it's all part of having a solid flow of data for that reaches the teams that have to know about that. And also another problem is filtering this data so not everyone gets all the data, but people get exactly what they need to solve a certain problem or to fix an issue.
Yeah, testing messaging queues. That's a really interesting one. What are some of the challenges you've seen when trying to test messages? And was it a messaging queue where they're guaranteed to arrive in order, or were they not guaranteed to arrive because there are some different types of messaging queues out there?
Fortunately, the messaging queues I had to test so far were in order, but of course you have challenges like the async arrival of messages. You cannot really say, okay, I call this endpoint and the response I get back is necessarily what I want, but it could be polling on server side. So yeah, lots of stuff.
Mhm. Yeah, that sounds pretty interesting. So, and then you also mentioned, I guess, streaming data there. What kind of challenges have you faced with streaming data?
Yeah, streaming data, that's kind of a problem like polling. Um, the asynchronicity is the biggest challenge, and how to set your timeouts, how to deal with the various error codes or HTTP status codes that can arrive, what to do if your data is not complete yet. So yeah, it always depends on the exact problem, the exact technology you're dealing with.
Yeah, so on the streaming data, um, especially if it's big data, I can think of a few challenges I've faced. And I showed up for a job one time, and my boss said, well, basically all we're doing is counting, but it's actually really difficult. And I'm like, well, what do you mean counting is difficult? And they're like, well, if we're receiving uh 2 million records per second and we want to do a unique count, we've got 2 million records coming in every single second, and we need to be able to group those and sort those in order to count them. And that's actually a very difficult engineering problem. And so, part of the aha moment for me on that was how much it makes a difference when something is running at scale or when it's running with large volumes of data, where the engineering problem is just fundamentally different than it would be if you were just doing it on a much smaller scale. uh it might just be the lag, I guess. But I don't know, it hasn't been too much of a problem lately. But uh yeah, so I guess I have, like, as we get towards the end of this episode here, I have another question for you. So you obviously wrote a book that we mentioned already, and I'm just curious, what got you started with the idea that that was something that you wanted to do, and how did you set about doing it?
Um, yeah, that's kind of interesting because I was approached by Pack Publishing, the publishing company, and they asked me if I could write a book about a topic that I didn't know too much about. So I said, no, I'm sorry. I think I would be the wrong person for this. But how about this? And I just threw the karate framework into the ring because I was pretty deep into it already in my work. And then they said, that sounds kind of interesting. And they did some research about what was already there, and there was absolutely nothing There was no literature about this, so we decided that this could be a good idea, and I think it was. I mean, I had a lot of fun writing it. It was a really, really cool personal challenge, and I'm really, really happy with the book. And I actually use it myself in my work. If I cannot remember a specific aspect of the framework, then I look into the book. So it's also a great documentation for myself.
Wow, that's so cool, and that must feel really rewarding to, you know, I need a reference to help me remember how to do this. Oh wait, here's my book.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, sometimes I'm hesitant to say it this way because it can also come across as bragging, but it it's kind of helpful for the team also when they have some problems that they know where to find the answer. If maybe the karate experts are not around.
Yeah. So you said that the publisher came to you in the beginning. What were you doing that you think got their attention for why they approached you?
I think part of that was that I was blogging a lot. I mean, I definitely have to start that again. And also because I appeared in more and more testing conferences and talked there. So that
Hmm.
kind of got me some publicity. So I guess that's where it all started.
Yeah, that's cool. A lot of people I think do it the other direction, right? They try to, come up with the idea and then go shopping around for publishers. So it's really cool that, you were able to get a publisher come to you, and then you didn't even do the idea they came to you with. You came up with your own idea, and they went with it. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, that was definitely a good coincidence that they accepted my just off the cuff idea.
Yeah. So if anyone in our audience, or even yours truly, is thinking about writing a book, what should we expect from the amount of time that it takes on a day to day basis to really get something useful out there?
So it is not a lot of time that uh, you have for a book like this. For me, it was from start to finish around 6 months, I would say. Um, but that was really, really good. I
And
mean,
is
for
that
me,
like all day long or part time?
no, that was not all day long. That was mostly after work. Like, they kind of estimate like 2 hours every day, but I couldn't do that. So some days I actually wrote absolutely nothing, and then on other days I wrote a few hours or did some on the weekends. Um, but the biggest part of that was, I think, writing all the example code first and then writing the chapters around that because I really wanted to go
Hmm.
into detail and explain it all correctly. And but I have to say the publishing company, they had some really, really good people that I worked with, so they did reviews all the time. I also had a reviewer within Travago, so I had a lot of people who helped me with this and get this into shape.
Yeah, that's really cool, and it's good that your company was supportive of that. Did you have to do anything internally to help get your company to be supportive of this idea, or was it just something where you brought it up? They said, "Yeah, run with it. That sounds good."
I had to pitch that idea internally, and also, I don't know how common that is in the US, but I had to sign an agreement, and they had to sign an agreement that I'm actually allowed to work on that outside my working hours, because it's for that time it was like a second job. But they were really, really supportive, and I think they they also liked it because actually gave Travago a little bit of publicity as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's awesome, and it's great that you were able to do that. A theme that keeps coming up on these episodes we've been doing with different people is, how important it is to have opportunities to go a little above and beyond what your day job is, whether that's going out and learning new things, whether it's finding problems within your organization that are things that are painful to everyone but nobody's tackling yet, and taking ownership of them and then coming to solve a problem, or just seeking other opportunities to help the community and get solutions out there. So kudos to you for being able to sell that idea within your organization, and thank you for sharing it with the rest of us so that we can learn from the valuable things you've figured out along the way.
Cool. Thanks a lot for those kind words.
Yeah, so we're wrapping up the episode here, but I'd really like to once again thank you for coming on the program. We've been speaking to Ben Bischoff, who is a test automation engineer for Travago, conference speaker, and author of Writing API Tests with Karate. So if you get an opportunity, I'd really encourage you to check out his book and give karate a try and see what you think about it for your API tests. Thank you, Ben.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks a lot for having me.